I definitely forecast it really exposing who is managing their money well, who are making great financial or investment decisions. We're going to see that very, very clearly in the coming years. So if you're acting wildly, if you're taking big chances, if you're not respecting debt, if you're using debt and you're not seeing big enough margins to pay that debt back very quickly, which is our strategy. Our strategy is not to avoid debt. Our strategy is to only use debt that can be repaid very, very quickly. Then I think you're going to run into some really challenging times, or at least have the potential to.
Based on, and let's say we are going into this recession, I don't see any way around it at this point. Again, it's going to be how severe versus how mild, in my humble opinion. How do you think credit's going to play into it? How is credit going to be handicapped? Let's assume that there is a recession. How is credit going to be handicapped during the recession? And how can you relate it to maybe 2008, 2009?
And I think that's what you have to do. I mean, how else are you really going to speculate what could unfold here, but then look back through history? And the 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12 timeline was a really prime example of what's possible there. I saw many people, myself included, go through the regrettable decision to exchange a property that we had purchased and overspent on for something like a short sale or a foreclosure. And doing that myself was a huge learning lesson. I did that with a fourplex. I've talked about that on other videos. One of my biggest L's in business, definitely a hit to the ego. And the lesson, like I said, was priceless, but it also dramatically affected my credit during that time. And at the time, I looked at it as an opportunity to use it as a teaching lesson for somebody that knew so much about credit. I've been a credit expert since 2002. So I knew that if I went through this, I could go through a much more rapid recovery than your average person. And therefore, I made the very difficult decision. It took me over a year to finally make the choice. And I asked literally 12 of my most trusted confidants, mentors, guides, people who I knew something about business and borrowing. And 11 out of 12 said that they would short sell. The 12th person said, you signed the line, you should pay. And I respected all those choices and all those answers, rather, but I made the decision after a lot of thought and a lot of time to go ahead and negotiate with the bank, and they agreed to pay $135,000 for a fourplex that or rather they accepted $135,000 from a different buyer. That was the way the short sale worked, for a property that I had paid $315,000 for a few years before that. So that really hurt my credit. And the only way a bank is willing to even entertain a negotiation like that is if you're already missing payments. You cannot go in there and say, listen, I realize I've been paying you on time every month, but would you be willing to accept, a 65% loss on this property for no good reason at all? The bank's going to say, absolutely not. So the strategy was to immediately begin to default on the loan. And that means missing payments. And I ended up with a whole slew, probably 7 or 8 mortgage late pays. And a mortgage late payment is considered one of the worst blemishes on your credit report, especially to new lenders. It's not necessarily worse for your scores, but most definitely it's worse in underwriting if you're applying for any new credit. So it really sidelined me during the best buying window in my lifetime, certainly. I would have loved to be picking up properties in 10, 11, 12, 13, and yet I short sold in 2009. And it took a good 36 months, even though my score...
You're on the sidelines 3 years. You're in the penalty box 3 years with that short. Yep.
That's right. And so even though my scores recovered because of the techniques that I applied, and I was right that I could get them back into those 700s fairly quickly, in under a year I was able to accomplish that, it just didn't matter. I couldn't get those mortgages again, no matter how badly I wanted them. So in order to stay eligible, you've got to make sure that you rise to the surface. The cream is going to go to the top here. And if you are one of those people that gets yourself into any type of trouble whatsoever, you're going to pay heavily for that moving forward. Being able to rely on liquidity and rely on leverage is going to be critical for most people who want to realize extraordinary success during this time, because most people just don't have access to unlimited amounts of their own money. So being able to leverage is so important. And you bet you're going to be competing against other borrowers that have managed to keep their finances in order. And the more debt you're taking on that could potentially cause those types of issues, or inability to repay, a cash flow crunch, only makes it that much more difficult for you to be able to bail yourself out, because you're not going to be able to go out and get these savior loans that are going to be able to rescue you. And so I definitely forecast it really exposing who is managing their money well, who are making great financial or investment decisions. We're going to see that very, very clearly in the coming years. So if you're acting wildly, if you're taking big chances, if you're not respecting debt, if you're using debt and you're not seeing big enough margins to pay that debt back very quickly, which is our strategy. Our strategy is not to avoid debt. Our strategy is to only use debt that can be repaid very, very quickly. Then I think you're going to run into some really challenging times, or at least have the potential to. So that's what we want to avoid. So make sure you're using these tools extremely carefully. But you're right, maximizing your credit worthiness will prove to be more important or even more valuable than ever before in the coming years. Okay, so one thing I want everybody to keep in mind here, Michael, is that guidelines for underwriting are always changing. So even if you keep a decent score or a good credit score, it might not be good enough. And products come and go. One bank might offer something right now that they won't be providing tomorrow. And the process to qualify for those tools changes regularly. Things will become tighter as time goes on. And that's why it's so important to not just put yourself in the strongest borrowing position that you can put yourself into, but to get access to the tools now when you need it the least, even before you potentially know what it'll be used for, in order to avoid missing out on having that tool, because that tool could not only literally change your life, but you might be approved for it today and not be able to get it tomorrow because the underwriting guidelines have switched. So what I'd love to do, if you're open to it, Michael, is I'd love to show for the very first time on this channel what the debt weapon cheat sheet looks like. And I apologize for the background noise, everybody. If you can hear that, there's a lot of construction going on in this building. Progress has not stopped yet, so that's a good sign. Great, so let's go ahead and take a look at this debt weapon cheat sheet here. This is a guide that I'm willing to give away to everybody. Like I said, this is the very first time we've ever done it. It's a simple PDF document. There's some guide instructions right here on the top that will teach you exactly how to go about starting to search for these various tools. One thing I've always tried to do inside our coaching is help people understand how to identify a great hole to fish in, a great body of water to fish in, versus providing them this or that great pool of water. Because you never know when that body of water or that fishing hole is going to be dried up and all those fish are long gone. It does you no good, at least no long-term good, for me to go out there and do all the research. What I want to show you is how you can do the research yourself, and this will actually give you the step-by-step directions to do that. You can go ahead and click the link in the description to gain access to this. Throw your email in there. This is totally free of charge. But down below, what you'll find is the actual questions that you'll need to be asking each and every institution that you reach out to in order to find whether or not an application for you makes sense. And the entire purpose of doing this in advance of submitting an application is to avoid having your credit pulled where a hard inquiry is added to your report only to lead to a declination. And as I'd mentioned before, loans will be declined. You might only increase your odds of approval from 50% to 65%. That's a rough estimate of what we think we see happening when people do their vetting like this. But going through and actually shopping several banks before giving permission to run credit and submitting the formal application allows you to lay the comparing loans side by side and really determine for yourself the differences between this home equity line of credit or that home equity line of credit provided by this bank or that bank, because the rates and terms will have some variations. And this will give you every single detail that you could possibly need that you can just go ahead and fill in. So I would just complete one of these for each bank. I would save this as its own separate worksheet that I would actually create for that perhaps specific institution. So if in the case of me applying for an Ent credit union, home equity line of credit. I maybe would have one for Pentagon Federal Credit Union and have that laid side by side. So I would have one of these completed for each bank or institution that I contact, and it should become fairly obvious to you by the end which debt weapon of that specific type makes the best sense for you. So this is every question that we can think of. There may be some additional details that come in that you maybe would just want to jot down on the notes. And one thing I find, and this is also indicated in the directions here on the first couple pages, is that a lot of these answers can be found directly through the website. So going in and sort of filling this out to the best of your ability prior to getting on the phone and making a phone call can make a lot of sense. But eventually you will probably want to speak to an actual banker, or even going into the branch to do so can oftentimes, I think, establish a little bit more of that old-fashioned bank to borrower credibility and relationship, that rapport. Do I really think it's gaining you some sort of a preferential treatment and your likelihood of approval goes up by doing that? Probably not. I mean, that would be wishful thinking. But you know, in some cases, I do think that some of the smaller, mid-size and credit union type of relationships, you know, I have a banking relationship in the small town I live in Colorado. You know, it's called Collegiate Peaks Banks. It's tiny, you know, 2,500 people in town. So we walk in and, you know, we have beers with those guys now and then. So we do have a little bit more of a rapport, and I think that at least you can have a little more direct communication about what it's going to take to get to the closing table before you submit the application. Worst case scenario is not that bad. Worst case scenario is you apply for the tool, you get declined, you end up with an inquiry, your credit score maybe gets hit slightly. Usually it's between 2 to 25 points for those inquiries, depending on how much depth there is and how good your credit is now. So 25 points would be rather severe, but more often than not, it's closer to the 2 point side. So not a big deal if you do apply and you're not approved, but we want to try and avoid that as much as possible, especially since we want to have applications being submitted on a regular basis, not frequent, but consistent. So a couple to few times per year, anywhere between 2 to 8 per year is what we would recommend. So that can be fairly aggressive depending on how many inquiries are already on your report and what you're trying to accomplish. You have 8 new inquiries show up on your credit report within 1 year. That can not only have an effect on your scores, but also raise eyebrows in underwriting where banks are going to say, hey, what is it you're applying for? Were you approved? Do you have other debts we can't see? Explain this. And they may ask for a letter of explanation or at least some sort of an explanation on each and every inquiry. Only the 10 most recent inquiries affect your credit within 1 year, 12 months. Okay? So we'll give this out to everybody. This is a really valuable tool. It's the first time we've ever done this in years and years and years of having this available for our coaching members. But I do think that this would help people with the imminent crash coming on the horizon here. You know, the more that we can be a resource of resources for people, the better.
Yeah, and just a couple of points of emphasis here. So first and foremost, love the guide here. I think you talked on inquiries. So the ability to do the research for these folks up front before they are pulling the trigger, so they don't have that shotgun approach and they've got, you know, 10 submissions going out there and all of those inquiries happening all at once. Guys, you can get yourself in a real tough pickle pretty quickly if you just allow those inquiries to mount up like that, and you're getting, you know, no fruit from that labor. You're getting just tons of declinations back. So love that guide. Additionally, guys, if you are going out and trying to, whether you know you're trying to take on a debt weapon or just get a loan, going to those local credit unions is so valuable as opposed to going to some of the Goliaths of the world, the B of A's and the Chases. There you're just a number. I've talked to a lot of people that have had a relationship with a local bank, a local credit union, for example. They didn't even know that those debt weapon products existed through there. And when they did make that, you know, kind of minimal effort to go in, they were just pleasantly surprised with the results that they got from that local credit union. So I can't implore folks enough, and you're obviously going on record and saying that before I am, to develop those relationships with those small banks. The likelihood of getting approvals there is going to be, I think, tremendously higher than, you know, going through a B of A, for example, or a Wells Fargo.
Well, I got
to disagree.
I got to respectfully disagree with you. I think that each serve their own purposes, and I've had tools from all of them. The banks you're mentioning.
With the exception of B of A, I've sort of avoided them. I just feel that, you know, for whatever reason, they're kind of the worst of the worst of the worst. I even have an unsecured personal line of credit through Wells Fargo. I did a video at one point where I showed that I went down and got access to, I think it was $16,000 in 16 minutes using an unsecured personal line of credit. And I still have that tool today. That tool is still available, same as cash. I can literally go on right now, transfer the money directly to my checking account, and as proven in that video, head straight to the bank and get the money out in cash. That was not that challenging to get access to. On the other hand, I've applied for a $100,000 unsecured business line of credit through Wells Fargo that I was declined for, even after receiving a pre-qualification that they mailed me. They took the time to actually put this marketing campaign together, send me a postcard about it saying, hey, here's your pre-approval code. And I called in, I said, what would you recommend I ask for? He said, ask for the full 100. Instead of actually receiving a counter, some gracious offer of maybe a $2,000 line, they just said no. So I said, why did you insist I apply? And he said, well, this is just a bunch of blah, blah. So it can be extremely frustrating. Like I said, don't get your hopes up when dealing with banks and or credit unions, but just know that the product lineup varies. And I've had some extremely good luck with JP Morgan Chase. I have a $50,000 unsecured business line of credit through them as well. And we'll make another video on exactly how to get approved for unsecured business lines of credit, because it's just an entire episode all on its own. I don't want to get into that right now since we spent so much time on home equity lines. But if you are in business for at least 2 years and you have activity, you can show tax returns and income, profit and loss statements, you could be eligible for some incredible tools. And literally within 15 minutes or less, I was walking out of Chase Bank on multiple occasions with $50,000 unsecured personal business lines of credit. Once back in 2008, I want to say, could have been 2007, and once again in 2017, because it was only good for 10 years. So they took it away from me. I went back in, reapplied, and was approved in under 15 minutes that second time as well. Same as cash. And the cool thing about unsecured business lines of credit that will tease everybody to come back for that upcoming episode is they don't report to personal credit. Even though I have personally guaranteed that debt weapon, it doesn't show up on my credit report. So that means I can use all 50,000 of that with absolutely no impact to my personal credit scores at all. Really, really powerful debt weapon. Those are things you can start to apply for even without waiting for that video by just using this debt weapon cheat sheet. So make sure you download a copy of that. Also, make sure you get the Cash Flow Cruncher too. That's a free tool that we give away here. Also, managing your money the right way and optimizing every single place possible is more important today than it has been in a very, very long time. So get that at cashflowcruncher.com. And then use these two tools in conjunction with each other. But really good question. I just think it makes sense to shop between some of the larger big boxes down to the mid-sized banks into the credit unions. And some of those credit unions are monsters too. When you talk about a company like PenFed Credit Union, it's a huge, huge company, and they market and sell in all 50 states. So they're somebody that might be a good place to shop. And frankly, they've had some of the best products I've seen in the last couple of years, including a non-owner occupied home equity line of credit for a long time. I don't believe it's still available, but they did provide it for a long time. So don't shortchange yourself by thinking I'm going to avoid that bank or this one. Just use the tool to shop them before you submit your applications. And to your point, minimizing the amount of inquiries, fruitless inquiries without approvals as possible is also a smart decision. All right, so that video went a lot longer than I expected it would. There's obviously a lot of information to talk about when you're discussing the topic of debt weapons and how these tools can help serve you and where to be careful by using them and what the application processes look like. But continue to stay tuned into the channel. We're going to continue to have as much new content as possible as the times continue to change and how it relates to these extremely powerful tools and how they may be able to serve you, not just to survive this really difficult upcoming market crash, but to thrive during it as well. This could end up proving to be the one or the two tools that end up building you your largest amount of wealth so far. So we're looking forward to seeing you on the next video. Michael, thank you for your time. We will check you guys on the next one. Until then, make it a great day and keep on cash flowing. Take care.
Got the money on my mind.